Hi there, it's Mr. Clark. Welcome to lesson 7.1.3 on phrases. So, we previously defined a phrase as a complete musical thought that ends with a cadence, and we're going to look at two specific configurations of specific kinds of phrases in this lesson, sentences and periods. So, we're going to start off with sentences. A sentence is a phrase, a single phrase, that generally contains 3 units. Generally in the proportions 2 to 2 to 4, or 1 to 1 to 2, depending on whether it's 8 measures total or 4 measures total. The first 2 units do not end with a cadence. If they ended with a cadence, it would be its own phrase. But there's only one phrase, so there's only one cadence. So the first unit, you get a motive, usually over a tonic chord. So here's an example from Beethoven, his first piano sonata, opening movement. That's pretty clearly a tonic chord. In the second unit, the same motive is repeated. Usually, it's varied in some way. Often, it's on the dominant chord or something else that's not exactly the same. So in this case, Beethoven puts it on a dominant chord. It's still recognizably the same. And then, so it's still recognizably the same, but it goes tonic and then dominant. Then in the third unit, the longer one, so that was 2 measures, 2 measures, now we're looking at 4 measures. In the third unit, the motive is broken up and developed. The chords go faster. We had 1 chord for 2 bars, blah. 1 chord for 2 bars, blah. But now, chord, 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 chord. So the harmonic rhythm speeds up how often chords change, and you actually end with a cadence this time. So, let's see. I'm sorry, I played measure 7 badly. No. There may be a typo in there. That doesn't sound quite right to me. I'll investigate later. I'll investigate now and pause the video. Yeah, that was a typo. Oops. So it should sound like this. That makes more sense. Cool. So, what's going on here? We had 2 bars. And then we took that da 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 motive and we went bia da da and we did bia da da and then we cadence da 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 da. We have a cadence at the end. So, what kind of cadence is it? Well, we're in F minor because we're outlining an F minor triad for our tonic, and we end on a C major chord. What is C major? What is C? If F is 1, F is 1, G is 2, A is 3, B flat is 4, C is 5. So we have a 5 chord, so that's going to be a half cadence because we end on a 5 chord. So that's sentences. The other kind of phrase we're looking at today is period. It's not actually a single phrase. That's a misnomer. It is a pair of 2 phrases, where the first phrase ends with a weaker cadence and the second phrase ends with a stronger cadence. And if you don't remember how cadences are weak or strong, here is your handy-dandy arrow of cadence strength. It's not an arrow, it's a line, because it goes in both ways. Woo, geometry. So normally the first phrase ends with a half cadence or an imperfect authentic cadence, and the second phrase usually ends with a perfect authentic cadence. It would be unusual to see a plagal cadence or a deceptive cadence in a period. Not saying it never happens, but usually half imperfect and perfect are the 3 kinds of cadences that you see. It could go half to imperfect, half in the first phrase, imperfect in the second phrase, because imperfect is stronger than half, that sort of thing. So these 2 phrases have specific fancy names. The first phrase of a period is called the antecedent, ante from Latin meaning before, and then the second phrase of a period is called the consequent, from the Latin word sequere, to follow. So before and follow. That makes sense. So here are some examples of periods. Have you ever heard of Mary Had a Little Lamb? Beautiful. So have I. Okay, so we could call that the end of a phrase, and we went from a 5 chord to a 1 chord. So that would be an imperfect authentic cadence because it's 3 in the melody. 3 to 5. And I've called this a perfect authentic cadence. Something should raise your hackles because this is not actually a root position 5 chord. So yes, you were right. In order for this to be a perfect authentic cadence, this would have to be a root position 5 chord. So changing that here. The reason I called it a perfect authentic cadence is because I put the melody in first and it goes stepwise 2 to 1, and then I just put in your standard voice leading here. But yes, it should be a root position 5 chord to be a perfect authentic cadence. So we went from imperfect to perfect. Here's an example where it goes from half to perfect. Jingle Bells. That can't be a cadence. That can't end a phrase because we haven't had any harmonic motion. It just stayed on a 1 chord. So we went from a secondary dominant, which we're not going to worry about till Unit 9, but we don't need to worry about it because it ends on a 5 chord, so that's a half cadence. And again, this would need to be a root position for this to be a perfect authentic cadence. So I'll put that in. There are different ways we can categorize our periods. Every period is either parallel or contrasting. If both phrases begin the same way, we call it parallel. So, Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. That's the same. That's parallel. Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Happens again down here. That's parallel. But when the phrases begin in different ways that sound sufficiently different, we call it contrasting. If they're pretty similar, you would call it parallel. If they're recognizably the same. But if they're just not, then you would call it contrasting. And here's an example from Chaminade. Yeah, I really can't see that. I'm going to bring it over here. Sorry. So we've ended on a 5 chord, so that's going to be a half cadence. And then we have the second phrase is completely different. And it's gone through some modulatory shenanigans, but all you need to know is that it goes from a root position 5 to a 1, because we have in D major, so there's our root position 5 to 1, and it goes 2 to 1 in the melody, so it's a perfect authentic cadence. You might be like, wait, we started out in G major. You're right, we did. Like I said, went through some shenanigans, we're fine. Every period is either symmetrical or asymmetrical. If two phrases are the same length, we call it symmetrical. All of the periods we looked at so far are symmetrical. If the two phrases are of different lengths, we call it asymmetrical. And here's an example of that. And so we have a 4-bar introduction. Not going to worry about that. And we have so that's 4 bars. And that's 5 bars. 4 is not the same as 5. So how did that happen? Well, we have like a 1 chord going to 4 to 5 to 1, and then some weird chords in there. We see some accidentals going on, but then we finally make our way back to 1. Beautiful. A period might end up in a different key than it started in, like our Chaminade example, and we call that a modulating period. We'll worry about that more in Unit 10. So, 3 different ways to categorize our periods. Everything is either parallel or contrasting. Everything is either symmetrical or asymmetrical, and then if it happens to end up in a different key, then it would be modulating. We're not really worrying about that this unit or next unit because we're dealing with diatonic harmony staying in a single key. That's what I got for now. See you next time.